Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to be discussing some of the recent updates in regards to the third interstellar comet, 3I Atlas. And technically this is the first update of 2026, mostly focusing on some of the recent observations and recent discoveries from the last month or so. And that's because both in January and February of 2026, a series of new studies and new observations revealed additional details, mostly by focusing on some of the emissions from the comet and by finally measuring its core. And so let's discuss exactly what scientists recently found, talk about some of the more unusual discoveries, and of course discuss how this comet changed in just the last few months. And interestingly, one of the most important discoveries and observations was actually done by the Hubble Space Telescope. And that's because for many months, the solid heart, or the main core of 3I Atlas, the nucleus, was hidden behind this very thick shroud of gas that's referred to as coma. And so trying to figure out exactly how large the nucleus was extremely challenging. But finally, by using specialized techniques and by actually observing nucleus through comparison of images between December 2025 and January 2026, some of which you see in this particular study, astronomers have finally seen the solid object itself, with the new data suggesting that the size of this nucleus is approximately 1.3 kilometers in radius or 2.6 kilometers in diameter. And intriguingly, this estimate has now been confirmed using additional research focusing on the non-gravitational effects, such as the orbital deviations, and by observing the variations in reflectivity as the comet spins around. Although here a small side note, here this assumes that this comet is just as dark as the comets we've seen in the solar system, so there's actually still a slight chance that the size is different if the surface of this comet is very different as well. But in this case, what's even more interesting is the actual shape. Based on these observations and based on the analysis, it appears to be aspherical, or basically not a sphere. It has a ratio of axes of about 2:1, meaning that it's approximately twice as long as it is wide. And this puts it in a somewhat unusual category, making it not as stretched as Oumuamua, but much more stretched than a lot of other planetesimals in the solar system, with these new studies suggesting that this is an elongated object. But a few months ago, there was actually another really interesting change on the surface of the comet. Now, normally we expect comets to be most active right when they're the closest to the sun. This is known as the perihelion, and that's when the comet receives most heat. And so you basically expect it to evaporate the most. But that's not what happened here. Turns out that 3I Atlas did something entirely different, and something we've never seen before. Based on some of the NASA's observations using SPHEREx mission and the SOHO-SWAN instrument, researchers revealed that the comet became very active sometimes in early November, late October. So basically this was already after the perihelion, when the comet was already receding from the sun. And surprisingly, by December, the production of water here surged by a factor of 40. In other words, suddenly the comet started to produce huge amounts of water compared to what it was doing before, and actually compared to many other comets we've seen previously. And that at first was kind of surprising, but actually confirms previous propositions we've discussed in one of the videos in the description. This bizarre flare-up directly confirms that the solar heat in this case took a very long time to penetrate the comet's outer crust. Or I guess just to rephrase this, one of the studies before actually tried to explain some of these observations as this really thick crust on the surface of the comet, possibly 10 to 15 meters in depth, that was actually created by all sorts of organic molecules that were converted by cosmic rays for millions and millions of years as the comet traveled across the galaxy. But the actual pristine materials, including water and a lot of other volatiles, were secretly hiding inside. And so now, after just a few years of traveling in the solar system, this protective shell has finally been removed, and the heat finally reached this pristine ancient ice buried deep inside, and basically made the comet erupt for the first time in its history. And that by itself is super interesting, because we're talking about ice that possibly has been trapped here for several billion years. So this is as pristine as it gets. It potentially is even older than the solar system. And based on the amount of ice that's been released, this once again confirms that the nucleus has to be relatively large and at least 2.5 kilometers across. But this also makes this a hyperactive comet that are actually somewhat rare in the solar system. Mostly because here it's releasing huge amounts of water, equivalent to approximately 2 Olympic pools being released every single hour. And for a lot of scientists, this was one of the most unexpected discoveries, but once again, almost certainly confirms this hypothesis. And so even though the comet was already exciting months ago, it has now become even more exciting. But on top of this, there was also the official detection of methane. This was actually one of the first mid-infrared studies using the James Webb Space Telescope, and it revealed the first ever detection of methane in any interstellar comet. Now, obviously, we've only seen 3 so far, but this is the first time one of them produced methane. But the reason this is kind of mysterious is because, once again, methane is very volatile and should have evaporated a long time ago. And this once again confirms that this methane, just like water, was very likely hiding under the crust and was protected from the solar activity until very, very recently. So it actually took the sun several months to finally crack the shell in order to start releasing all of these compounds. Additionally, the study also confirmed the presence of carbon dioxide and atomic nickel, which was very likely linked to a lot of complex organic molecules, creating what's known as organometallic structures. Now, that by itself is not unusual, and we've discussed this previously, but in this case, the ratio of nickel to iron was a little bit different from everything else we've seen. But the main point here is that the structure and the composition of this comet was quite different from a typical solar system comet. Not to mention that additional observations also revealed organic hydrocarbons and even things like cyanide that seem to be also trapped within the comet this whole time. And so in essence, these studies confirmed that this was a very strange object until the sun finally cracked it open, and it then became an extremely active comet, not so different from what we usually detect in the solar system. Except that in this case, it was releasing a lot of stuff all at once. But when it comes to all of these emissions, here recent studies discovered that the polarization curve is different from a typical comet in a solar system, with the overall amplitude of polarization being larger, suggesting this comet has very distinct surface and dust characteristics. So basically, the grain particles and the surface is very different from a typical comet that we normally detect every year. And it might also contain relatively complex compounds or dust aggregates that we've actually never seen before anywhere. In other words, this comet might contain a lot of chemistry we never imagined, because once again it could have spent billions of years traveling between stars and being constantly bombarded by the cosmic rays. And well, I think this image basically summarizes everything all at once. In just the last month, researchers discovered a lot of stuff suddenly coming from inside this object. And a lot of these particles seem to be relatively large, possibly even being several millimeters across, as opposed to tiny dust particles we usually see. But we also should tackle that other question, the one in regards to aliens. So basically, can we settle the SETI question? And the answer is yes. At least 2 separate investigations focused on trying to detect any unusual signals, with both studies trying to find out if there is maybe something unusual going on the surface or inside, or if there are any unusual radio signals that someone might be sending toward us. And so the results from these 2 major searches using the Allen Telescope Array and the Green Bank Telescope that focused on these deep scans of the object as it moved away from the sun, and in this case focusing on a wide range of radio frequencies, found absolutely no evidence of anything unusual. As a matter of fact, the Green Bank Telescope was so sensitive that it could have detected a signal that was as weak as 0.1 watts. Essentially, if someone accidentally left some kind of a smartphone on the surface, you would have seen the smartphone trying to communicate. And every single candidate signal detected in the last few months was directly traced back to some kind of a radio frequency from Earth, or some kind of a satellite or airplane passing overhead. And so both of these studies once again find absolutely no evidence of technosignatures and confirm that this is a natural comet. But this doesn't change the fact that this is still one of the most exciting objects coming from somewhere else, and literally represents a cosmic time capsule that contained this ancient material from possibly billions of years ago. And with its high levels of carbon dioxide, the presence of methane, and the sudden eruption of water in the last few weeks, can actually tell us so much about these distant star systems we will potentially never get to visit. And so here we get to study the chemistry of a completely different star system by focusing on studying this ancient object. And though it has not been done yet, by essentially comparing the recipe coming from the star system to what we have here in the solar system, this might help us understand if the solar system is indeed unique and unusual, and possibly help us understand how terrestrial planets like Earth may form. But even based on the observations so far, 3I Atlas seems to be super strange, very enriched in CO2, and seems to contain the ratio of elements we don't usually see in a normal comet, with the suggestion so far being that it might have formed in a much colder or much more irradiated environment compared to a typical object in the solar system. But I guess the question is, okay, so what's next? Well, as I mentioned, 3i Atlas is now moving away, and is going to get dimmer and dimmer every single week. But in March 2026, it's actually going to pass very close to Jupiter, at a distance of about 0.36 astronomical units, and so it might once again be visible to certain probes orbiting Jupiter. Although here, interestingly, it seems to be passing extremely close to the Jupiter's heliosphere, or essentially the region where Jupiter usually is able to capture objects and turn them into its own moons. Now in this case, this comet is moving a little bit too fast, but if it was moving slower, it could have become one of the Jupiter's moons. But on that note, we're probably going to discuss this again, maybe in the next few months, once there are some additional updates. Until then, check out previous videos in the description. Thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support the channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM it directly, or by joining a channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.